Recording.
All right, everyone, good evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is Christine Ingram. I'm the local interest librarian here at New Hanover County Public Library. Today's program is part of the Dwell with Gratitude and Pride, a panel discussion on the Wilmington Campaign. We have with us Caitlin O'Connor and Becky Sawyer, both historians from Fort Fisher State Historic Site. We have Daniel Jones, the cultural curator at Cameron Art Museum, and Jim McKee, Brunswick Town Fort Anderson site director. These panelists will provide summaries of key battles and biographies of the people in the military conflicts. Caitlin will be our moderator tonight and guide the discussion, but the audience members are welcome to ask questions of their own. Caitlin is a public historian at Fort Fisher State Historic Site. She's particularly interested in African-American history and public programming to share those stories. At Fort Fisher, Caitlin serves as the Education and Outreach Coordinator. She earned her bachelor's in history and will soon complete her master's in public history, both from NC State University. And with that, I will turn it over to Caitlin for further introductions.
All right, well, good evening, everybody. Thank you guys so much for coming out. We're excited to be here. Thank you again for the library for hosting this. And so I assembled our panel here tonight because the hopes of kind of putting the different pieces of the Wilmington Campaign all together. So Wilmington Campaign and to capture Wilmington in the Civil War took place in January and February of 1865. So our site's been working the last few months to commemorate those battles and these stories. So we thought it'd be a good idea to kind of wrap up as we conclude that campaign with a good summary and discussion of how our sites play together, as well as how different people throughout the campaign impacted the battles here in Wilmington. And so I want to echo what Christine said. We encourage you, it's a panel discussion. We're going to be having conversations, and we encourage you guys as the audience to get involved and share your questions and your thoughts. And so I actually thought before we dive in and before I introduce the panel, I'd actually start by asking you guys a question out in our audience today. So by show of hands, how many of you grew up here in North Carolina? I did. Okay. For those of you who grew up in North Carolina, or even those who didn't, did any of you learn about the Wilmington Campaign or Wilmington's role in the Civil War in school?
Oh, in college.
Yeah.
College.
A little bit. So that's kind of my case too. I grew up in Raleigh, and so we learned about the North Carolina role in the war generally. I remember learning that North Carolina contributed more soldiers to the Confederacy than any other state, and that there were some battles in the Outer Banks and New Bern, but I didn't learn anything about Wilmington's role in the war until I was applying for internships and had to learn something in order to impress the interview hiring manager. So here I am 6 years later, now working here at the site and learning so much more about the central role Wilmington played at the end of the war. So hoping we can flesh that out for you guys tonight. So let me introduce our panelists, and then I'll kind of pose that same question to them and see what their responses are. So to my right here is my colleague Becky Sawyer from Fort Fisher. She's the the curator and lead researcher at the site. And she curates a number of temporary exhibits for us. And her current research focuses, well, it's all over the place in a very good way. And it focuses on enslaved laborers in the Wilmington region during the Civil War, Union sailors from all around the world. And one thing I am really excited about is the tattoos of the Union Navy sailors. I think it hopefully will inspire some of my next ink. So that is Miss Sawyer. Next to her is Daniel Jones. Daniel is a history graduate from UNCW, class of 2018. He worked at a number of local museums in their education departments while doing a lot of research on African-American coastal life. And so his work led him to Cameron Art Museum, where he resides as their first cultural curator, tasked with continuing research and interpretation of their Civil War site and implementing those narratives into local K-12 curriculum, while also creating accessible programming around the site for Wilmington. So thank you, Daniel, for being here. And we also have Jim McKee, who is the site manager at Brunswick Town for Anderson State Historic Site in Winnebago on the other side of the river. He is a native North Carolinian and still a student of North Carolina history. His current research includes 18th century naval stores and rice industries, Fort Brunswick, and 1865 refugee crisis, as well as several other topics of interest. So, Daniel, Jim, I know you guys both kind of went to school in North Carolina, and I saw you shaking your head. Did you guys learn anything about Wilmington growing up here? Wilmington's role in the Civil War, particularly?
I didn't learn anything in college. I mean, honestly, they wouldn't let me take courses in my field of interest. In high school, we basically learned about blockade running and the importance of Wilmington in blockade running. We learned Wilmington was the most important port. It's the port that kept the Army of Northern Virginia supplied. And when it fell, Lee surrendered 6 months later. Oh, and in between there was the Battle of Bentonville. It's pretty much what we learned about North Carolina in high school. Then again, I also ended up partially teaching the class my freshman year in high school.
Well, that's a story for another day. That sounds very interesting. But I don't know, Daniel, if you had anything you might have learned in North Carolina, or you're like me back in Raleigh, and I didn't learn anything about here.
Yeah, my memory of Civil War in high school, I remember jumping to major points very quickly. I mean, we're on that strict schedule and they have to get us ready for exams by the end of the semester. So you have X amount of days on each topic, so you can't really get too in depth. So my understanding of the Civil War when I was young was North, South, slavery, emancipation, Gettysburg, Abraham Lincoln's assassination at the end. And then you move to the next unit. And that's all I remember. I mean, we never took the time to talk about our own state, which was kind of weird to me. Definitely learned way more about Gettysburg and Antietam more than anything that happened here in the state.
Yeah.
Even my history project in high school was Gettysburg. I mean, that was, and I was distracted. There was too many girls in high school to remember what was going on. Oh, learning.
And I remember too, we tend to look at every major war like this, except for maybe the Revolution. I remember even once we got to World War II, it's like Pearl Harbor, D-Day, victory.
Drop the bomb.
Yeah, and that's how they wrap it up. They get it going so fast, and it's just as fast.
Yeah, so as we all know now, working here in the area, and obviously people who grew up North Carolina, Missouri, had no idea about Wilmington's central role in the Civil War, so we had to learn it, just like a lot of you guys have locally come to appreciate Wilmington's role. But for those of you who might not be as familiar, I wanted to give a brief synopsis that might help as we continue our talk today. So Wilmington does play an important role at the end of the Civil War and really throughout the war for the state of North Carolina. By 1862, the Union has captured New Bern and the Outer Banks. So effectively, Wilmington's the only port city left for the state fairly early on. So the South's economy is based on slavery and cash crops. So they're very good at making things, of course, with people that make things, not very good at producing weapons for a sustained revolution, right? So they need to import candles, coffee, leather goods, muskets, cannonballs, all of this stuff, big and small, that you need to fight the United States military. And so Wilmington becomes that vital trade network for the Confederacy here in North Carolina, and more broadly, our railroad lines lead up into Virginia, so we supply Lee's army as he goes through Virginia and into Pennsylvania. But by the middle of 1864, the Union has effectively closed every other sort of southern port city except for Wilmington. So we are it. Anything any army needs has to come essentially from right here in Wilmington. And so while all of this is going on, we built defenses along, this is the lower Cape Fear. And so we built defenses like Fort Fisher, Fort Anderson up here, all these other forts all throughout the river to ensure that our blockade runners, those ships that are bringing those vital supplies in and out of the South, are able to get to the Caribbean and make those trades. They're doing that because the Union Navy is blockading Wilmington off the course of Fort Fisher at this new inlet, and as well as Fort Caswell down here. If you can see Daniel said down here at Fort Caswell, the old inlet. And so we have these Confederate forts defending the river. We also have the Union Navy creating this blockade. And this is the interlude, the interplay for most of the war here. By the fall of 1864, Wilmington's that last port city. So the Union develops a plan to capture Wilmington, to put that final nail in the Confederacy coffin, if you will. So they attack Fort Fisher first and establish a foothold on the lands. We're right here, down here on the tip of this peninsula. And from here, we capture Fort Fisher in mid-January 1865. From here, it's essentially a two-pronged approach into Wilmington, which is about 15 miles north. So U.S. colored troops and one white brigade lead the charge from Fort Fisher north all the way into Wilmington, which is up here. And we have thousands of white U.S. Army soldiers sailing across the river down to Smithville, which is now Southport, and charging north on this western bank of the Cape Fear River, going through places like Fort Anderson and Town Creek on their way up to Wilmington. So that is the campaign in a nutshell. By February 22nd, the troops converge right outside of Wilmington. The town is formally surrendered. And now hundreds of free African Americans line the streets to celebrate emancipation and freedom. And what's really a day of jubilee and celebration for so many is also kind of a nightmare for the Confederacy. With Wilmington in Union's hands, General Lee, General Johnston have nowhere to get their supplies. So by April, they surrender in Virginia and North Carolina, respectively. So that is the role Wilmington plays in the end of the Civil War. We're gonna flesh that out a bit tonight, talking about more details, but I wanted to give you guys a brief synopsis. And it really makes me think that the Wilmington campaign really does get overlooked a lot in our collective state and national understanding of the Civil War in favor of big bloody battles like Sharpsburg or Gettysburg. And very few of us, except for maybe who grew up regionally here, ever heard about Wilmington's role in the war. So I was wondering, panelists, if you kind of have any idea or theory about why Wilmington campaign doesn't receive much national or even statewide attention.
I think it's partially due to the fact, looking at it by the numbers. I think a lot of times when we look at war, we look at it through such a macro lens. And you want to see the biggest battle. You want to know where the largest amount of casualties were. You want to know what speech was given after, where the treaties were signed, where the surrenders were signed. And we fall in that aftermath period of major turning points. What we did was very important in fast tracking the end of the war, but the end was on the horizon, I believe. The end was near. I believe that was felt through the North and the South. Morale was low in the South, and we knew they were on the brink of victory. And so I think it gets overlooked because it was coming.
I think also you have Lee surrenders at the beginning of April, and then Johnson surrenders. And in between that, you have Lincoln's assassination. So you have so many moving parts that we kind of get swept under the rug. And I think also because you always hear about Gettysburg and all these, what's called the Army of Northern Virginia and all these other, mega battles out there, up in Virginia and Maryland and Pennsylvania, but you don't hear about us and you don't hear about the battles out in the West either. So I think it's who's controlling the history after the war, who determines what's going to be remembered and what's not.
Yeah, North Carolina, throughout the war, y'all probably heard the old, well, maybe you haven't.
Say it, come on.
We're a veil of humility surrounded by two mountains of conceit. Virginia to the north, South Carolina below us, of course.
Yeah.
But North Carolina was always considered the back one. It was a sideshow to the main show that was happening in the Eastern Theater, up in Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania. and to the west, with the big battles with Grant, starting with Shiloh, Atlanta, Chickamauga, Vicksburg. So North Carolina is just completely overshadowed by the rest of the war. And Wilmington, especially the Wilmington Campaign, like these two said, it's the end. And but does that downplay what the role was? No, it shouldn't. I mean, Wilmington was a big reason why Lee was able to fight. One of the big misconceptions is the South had nothing. The South had plenty, and a lot of that plenty is coming into Wilmington. They just didn't have the infrastructure to get it from point A to point B without going through C, D, E, and F. And what made Wilmington so important was that Wilmington Railroad. When the war started, it was the largest single gauge railroad in the world and ran almost to the Virginia line. So you're getting supplies at a fair clip closer to the front. So, but it just gets overshadowed. It's a side show.
To ask questions? Sure. I thought that you're saying that the South had, or Wilmington had nothing, but
That was a misconception. They had everything.
I thought factories were all up north, and we had the South, not we, because I wasn't born here. we had just cotton and the raw materials that we always sent up north to be made into something.
Correct.
So how did we have everything? I don't understand your statement.
Because there was so much being brought in.
Oh,
And there was, don't get me wrong, there was manufacturing in the South.
there was?
Yeah.
There was some, Birmingham, Alabama, Mobile, the Ironworks. Oh, yes.
Okay.
And you also have
Richmond.
Tredegar Iron
You had
Works.
Tredegar. So when you're looking at war materiel, the cannons, okay,
Ammunition.
ammunition, they're not able to make as many cannons as they need. They're importing, and they're beg, borrowing, and stealing, and they're making battlefield captures, and they're taking guns that they capture. For example, think about this, the South had no military when everything broke out. They had,
You had military academies.
right, you had military academies, and you had captured forts that had its ordnance still intact, like Fort Castle, Fort Macon, Fort Sumter. Granted, they had to take Fort Sumter, Fort Pulaski. So all these major fortifications that are in southern states had their ordnance. But what really supplied the South right off the bat with the big cannons was Virginia capturing Gosport Navy Yard on April 19th, 1861. They captured 1,198 heavy guns. And when I say heavy guns, we're talking 32 pounders all the way up to 10-inch.
Did we get any help from overseas, like the British?
Oh, God.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. That's
They made some serious
they made serious
bank.
bank, right? But the cotton is cotton's
Except for they
currency,
trade.
right?
Okay.
In the beginning, so the United States has only been able to successfully economic boycott Britain once. And that was in 1765-66 during the Stampede. After that, Britain learned, and they started looking for other markets. So on the eve of the war, there was rumblings. Yeah, they knew something was going to happen. There was going to be a split. And they had a pretty good idea of what the South was going to do. And that idea was to hold their cotton ransom. So what does Britain do? They look for other markets. Egypt, India. So when the war breaks out and the South holds back its cotton, hoping that the northern factories are going to be begging for it and will force the British government to recognize, they're like, nah, we got. So, yeah. So they're trading cotton. So eventually the South says, heck with it, and they just start trading cotton. Yeah. So they're getting everything in, and anything that comes into Wilmington, that's got to go to, say, Virginia. It's a pretty quick run to Virginia. But if it's gotta go anywhere else, oh no, it's tough, because the railroads in the South were just, they weren't to the same standard as the North. And I could go into more detail on that, but that, we don't need to do that. Suffice to say, to get to point A to point B, they had to go through C, D, and C, D, and G to get to B. A lot of times. So they just didn't have the means to get it.
So Wilmington becomes so important because it brings in all of those supplies that are needed. Like Jim said, it's not the South doesn't necessarily have them, it's distributing them from places like Wilmington. And so as we kind of think broadly about the Wilmington campaign, if we were to get more attention nationally by state, that means, you know, our sites would have a bigger role to play in shaping and impacting Civil War history. So my question now to you guys is, what is significant about your site, your battlefield, that you think people should know about? I'll start with Daniel.
Well, mine was probably the smallest out of all the battles that happened during the Wilmington campaign, excuse me. This is the last one. And once they get across those defensive positions that run through our grounds from Camp Harbors, and Wilmington is just about 3 miles. Well, that technically is Wilmington. Wilmington City Center is just a few miles down the road. It's a quick march. I know it took them a couple of weeks to march from Fort Fisher to Forks Road with the skirmishes and fighting that they did, but that Forks Road to Wilmington march, they did this in the next 24 to 48 hours. And they immediately get to Wilmington and they liberate that town. So ours plays that, you know, the signing off. It's done, it's complete after they get through our area.
Well, I mean, I joke we were the largest state castle ever built during the Civil War. But, you know, Fort Fisher protected the Fort of Wilmington. And without Fort Fisher, you know, you don't have Wilmington. And that was evidence because Fort Fisher falls January 15th, 6 weeks later, Wilmington falls, and then not even 2 months later, all of Confederacy. Yeah. So there's this, you know, ripple effect. You know, we tell people, you know, Fort Fisher, you know, was a perfect fortification. It changed because when Fort Sumter was humbled down to one level, it was a 3-story fort, humbled down to one level because it was brick and mortar. They learned sand fortifications were the way to go. And so that's how, you know, Fort Fisher did not become destroyed during the 2 bombardments. It's Mother Nature and mankind later on destroys us. So that's, I mean, it's, and with the recent research, it's nice to be able to tell more stories that are intertwined at our site. So,
Jim, what's one thing people should know about Fort Anderson?
It was, Fort Anderson was the template that became Fort Fisher. I mean, it really was. The engineers that work on Fort Anderson, after the fort's mostly complete, and Fort Anderson runs for 1.25 miles. It has about 1.25 miles military frontage. Now, what is the template for Fisher is the 2 water batteries. And the engineers constructed those so well that by early July 4th, 1862, they're pulled out of what was then known as Fort St. Philip and transferred to across the river. At the time that they go over there, Fort Fisher doesn't exist.
No.
It is just a series of sand batteries. And what they do, the first thing they do is connect the dots with sand walls. Then they start building up everything. Whereas Fort Anderson, the highest point at Fort Anderson, well, the average height is 32 feet, with the highest point of 38. Fort Fisher averages 40 feet, 43 feet actually, 43 feet high. And Pierce they had 57 guns, roughly.
something like that.
But it was Pierce for more than that. They just didn't have enough to fill every gun emplacement. Anderson had 11. But we weren't going to have to take on the whole Union Navy. The other thing about Anderson, yes, is strictly got the Anderson is strictly just one of the links in the chain of forts guarding Wilmington. Anderson's right there, but it's the halfway point between the mouth and Wilmington. So it's not going to have to face, the full onslaught of the Union Navy, but its primary purpose was to serve as, and this is relevant today, it served as the main quarantine station for blockade runners. Its other importance will occur after the war is over.
And we'll talk
Well,
about
not even
that.
after the war is over. Well after the fall of Wilmington, it will have great influence in where we're sitting right now. Which that's not on the schedule, but that's a whole different story.
All right, well, we're gonna transition, talk more detail about these sites, but I want to pause and see if we had any questions from the audience at this point.
I have one. Sorry. One of the panelists mentioned the fact that who wrote history really determines on how that history is then kind of told later on. And I kind of want to just hear a little bit more about that. What do you feel that some of the importance of Wilmington was intentionally, unintentionally kind of left out of how the story of Wilmington was told? I'm also a North Carolina native. I thought it was a pretty good history education growing up in the public schools, and got to Wilmington and found out that I knew virtually nothing about Wilmington's role in lots of different things, but talking today specifically about the Civil War.
Sure.
So, the saying, to the victors go the spoils. And 9 times out of 10, you in a war, the victors write the history. And there was a lot of that immediately in the aftermath. You had several histories being written but they're mainly by participants. It's not a comprehensive history of the war for the most part. The military is writing some. In the South, you've got newspaper editors writing the history of the war, giving it a Southern slant. All through early and through Reconstruction, you're getting some of that. Some of those histories. It slows down some. But once Reconstruction ends, the Southern version of the history of the war just explodes. Nobody wants to hear about Wilmington. Bentonville's the biggest battle that occurs in North Carolina. Yeah. War's over. It has no meaning. There's glory, but it's not the glory that you see at Gettysburg, which is what? It's a Southern loss.
Well, think about it. You don't hear about Vicksburg.
You don't hear about Vicksburg. Yeah.
Yeah.
In Vicksburg, in Gettysburg,
Happened on the same day.
July 1863 is the pivotal month in American history for that war. But you got to look at the times. It's all about honor. It's all about glory. It's glorified. Plus, you're dealing with the myth, the whole myth of the lost cause is coming out, especially at the end of Reconstruction. And Wilmington, North Carolina, is the lost cause. It is a lost cause. So there's no glory in their minds. And it's being completely overshadowed by the Eastern Theater. Even during the war, the Eastern Theater, we're talking Army of Northern Virginia versus Army of the Potomac, garners all the attention. Everything else is backward, secondary. So that's part of it. If it's not dealing with Lee, Grant, Burnside, then it's taking a second fiddle to everything. And North Carolina's taking a third fiddle.
And what I remember about Fort Fisher's battle, or part of it, towards the end of the war, all the adults were fighting the battles. What was left was 14, 15, 16, 17. Is that true? Is that
You did have some junior reserve soldiers at Fort Fisher during the December battle. However, most of them were captured during that battle and were sent to Point Lookout those that did not get captured got sent up to Kinston, and eventually they fought at Bentonville. So there were what they call the junior reserves. We also had the senior reserves. And the senior reserves were actually up at Sugarloaf.
Right.
So you had basically this last grass straw of getting more manpower by pulling in 15, 16-year-olds and men who were over 45. And they did participate in the Battle of Fort Fisher, but not to the level of the other regiments that were there.
You also got to take into consideration, aside from junior reserves, senior reserves that are fighting in North Carolina, the federal government in Richmond at this time, mainly after the fall of Fort Fisher, when you get into February of 65, they're talking about arming the slaves. They're talking about putting slaves, training them, putting them in the army and promising their freedom. They'll fight.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I mean, not just, not just Richmond,
No.
but
Yeah.
other.
it had been talked about.
Claiborne.
Patrick Claiborne had talked about it in 63. And he was, for the most part, ostracized.
Yeah.
For even broaching that subject in the Western theater. And so when he was killed at Franklin, it was no big deal. His career was done just because he broached that subject. But by February 65, it's actually being debated in Confederate Congress. And in March of 65, Lincoln is publicly joking about it.
It is a debate that's going on even earlier, but the reason it never gains any traction is just going back to the heart of what the Confederacy is.
Yeah.
The Vice President says the cornerstone rests on Negro inequality. So the idea of arming people who we were trying to keep in bondage by force is just ludicrous, rightfully so, to so many. And that's why this debate does appear in February and March, but we have to be careful not to overstate it. There were desperate people thinking this is a last-ditch effort, always to preserve slavery at the end of the day. But it is not anything that gains any sort of really big support in the South. It's not like they're going to choose the South being an independent nation over the South being a slave-holding nation. That is always their priority. So we want to make sure we acknowledge that when we have this conversation. And so I want to transition a little bit, be mindful of our time, to some of these battle-specific questions. So, we talked a lot about the battles. We're starting to talk about the battles themselves, but for 3.5 years, there's a lot else going on here. We talked about that briefly in the introduction, how Fort Fisher is primarily bearing that bulk of protecting Wilmington against the Union Navy who's blockading the port city. And so, Becky, in the last few years, you've done a lot of research as well as other historians at Fort Fisher on not just what the Confederates are doing at Fort Fisher, but how the Union Navy being here actually provides an avenue of freedom for so many dozens and dozens of enslaved people in the greater Wilmington region. So can you describe for us that journey of freedom that they go on and what might happen to a person once they reach the Navy?
So early on, former enslaved men sought U.S. Navy vessels, which were offshore of Wilmington and New Inlet. And the term contraband is used in early December of 1861 for these African Americans who are seeking protection under the United States flag. And then during the height of the yellow fever epidemic in September of 1862, we know of 27 men who used the epidemic. So nothing's happening in Wilmington during the yellow fever epidemic. Nobody's bothering to check boats or whatever. So you have over the course of 2 weeks, 27 men just floating down the Cape Fear River and being picked up by the Union fleet off of Fort Fisher and off of the Cape Fear River. And some of these men included William Gould, who was an artisan at the Belby Mansion. His initials are over there. He was a plasterer. You also have other men such as William Northrop, who changes his name to William McLaurin, and Charles Mallet, who served until February of 1865 with the fleet off of Fort Fisher, off of Wilmington. And once Wilmington's captured, their term of service is over with. They are released from the Navy and they settle here in Wilmington. Now, many times they would be given the rate of boy or wardroom servant early on. But by 1864, such as the case of Joshua Howard, he made the rank of landsman on the Monticello. So they were basically showing their worth on board these ships. And then we have an episode in February of 1864 where several children and some women drowned when their vessel fell apart when they were seeking being a refugee. Let me pull that up. Print it out. So in February of 1864, the U.S. steamer Governor Buckingham writes that the sea was rough from the south to west, and the boat striking against the ship's side, being very rotten, immediately swamped and sank, succeeding in finally picking up 4 men, 2 women, and 3 children, named as follows: Peter Smith, Fortune Kirby, Philip Smith, Joe Holden, Teresa Hewitt, Phyllis Holden, and 3 children. One of the latter, so one of the women died, and all 3 children drowned. So you have that going on. And there's also conflict amongst the officers, what to do with these people. If the men could serve in the US Navy, they would enlist them into the Navy. But what to do with these women and children? So there's also another incident where there was a conflict. They're like, what do we do with these people? And so the officer in charge of that vessel, he said, in my best interest, in the best interest of these people, I cannot abandon them. So he took them to Beaufort. And so you have a refugee camp being established around Beaufort and Morehead City and all that during the war.
You touched on something really interesting there. So at the start of the war, these formerly enslaved people who have self-emancipated, have taken this initiative and freed themselves, they are relegated to the lowest ranks, and we see that with the Navy, particularly of formerly enslaved people relegated to the lowest ranks, as well as Black Northerners as well. But here on these ships, as you kind of allude to, by the end of the war, white people are not necessarily welcoming of everyone on board, but they are working in close quarters, and there is a reluctance and eventually some sense of camaraderie forming. So by 1864, we see people getting into higher ranks.
Yeah, and the Navy, has taken on people of color for a long time, a lot more so than the Army. So people knew that they could go to the Navy or try to seek out protection with the Navy because they knew they would be accepted. If they try to go out to the Army, probably not so much. So
part of what you're saying, all these people of color coming in, we're kind of creating some diversity in the service that we don't see with the segregated Army. And so one of the other great things even doing research-wise is showing that it's not just white and Black diversity on these ships. There are people from all corners of the world here. And so I guess what makes the Navy so diverse, which you kind of touched on, but how do sailors from the Far East and Latin America end up right here in Wilmington during the Civil War?
Either they are being picked up by merchant vessels from where they lived at and they came to the United States, or they're living here. So a friend of mine posted last year about, it was during Asian Pacific Islander Month last May, and he said there was only 7 people that served at Fort Fisher. Well, I went to prove them wrong, and I found 30 men who were with the fleet during both battles. And ironic, us as historians, we tend to go down rabbit holes a lot, and a little bit. And one of my men that I found, who was from the East Indies. So he was from Asia, and I found him on board one of the vessels, the USS Cherokee, during the first battle. And then I was doing research on something completely different, and I found that he had served in a Confederate battery and got captured at Lookout Mound. Gets sent to Chicago as a POW, and in January of '64, they're basically saying, if you want to get out of the prisoner of war camp, you can join the Union Navy. And so they had that happen in Chicago and Point Lookout and other places. And he was one of them. I was just like looking like, hey, what? So he lived in Louisiana, joins a Confederate battery, gets captured, then had the option to join the Union Navy, joins the Union Navy, and ends up here at Fort Fisher during the first battle. But there's also amongst the Asian and Pacific Islanders almost a separation. Asian descent men served mostly as cooks and servants, while the Pacific Islanders served as landsmen and they had rank. So you see that a lot. You see that and you're just like, And most of these men joined in New York, Philadelphia, up in New Hampshire. So again, that's where I get the theory that they must have been on a merchant vessel, and that's how they came to the United States, and that's how they joined the Union Navy. So that's my theory. I can't prove it, but that
makes sense to me.
Yeah.
All right, so of course, this activity with the Navy happening offshore, and the Confederates here in Wilmington are preparing defenses and training to beat back those Navy vessels. And so, Jim, we'd be remiss in a series all about war not to talk about weapons technology and how that contributes. So you are one of our weapons safety officers in historic sites, and you lead a lot of interpretation for cannon demonstrations at Fort Fisher and Fort Anderson. So I was curious if you could briefly kind of tell us how weapons technology shapes the Wilmington defenses or the battles here.
Well, Becky actually touched on it a little bit with Fort Sumter. Yes, Fort Sumter started out as a 3-tiered brick fortification, and it was just after the bombardment, it was heavily damaged. But it's really not until April of 1862, with the reductions of Fort Pulaski and Fort Macon. Fort Pulaski outside of Savannah, Fort Macon up on Atlantic Beach, that everything changes. So Fort Anderson, they start building Fort Anderson in late March of 1862, just before Fort Pulaski. Now, Fort Pulaski and Fort Macon, they're like Fort Caswell, Fort Sumter, they're all sisters. They're third system forts. They're made of brick. And
in the 1830s.
Right. And the third system is any fort designed or built between 1816 and 1860. But they all have similarities, but they all are constructed differently. So if you defeat one, you don't have a blueprint to defeat the others until 1859. 1859, the U.S. Army adopts the 10-pound Parrott rifle, a rifled artillery piece. Very quickly, everybody starts building bigger rifles, rifle guns. And when the Union attacks Fort Pulaski, they actually get into the dunes around the fort and move their way closer until they're within range of the fort. And they take their rifled artillery and they aim at one spot on the wall and pound it. So against traditional smoothbore artillery, meaning firing cannonballs, that fort should have held out for about 2.5 to 3 weeks. With rifled artillery, it held out for about 20 hours. In 20 hours, it was breached and surrendered. They did basically the same thing a couple of weeks later at Fort Macon, only they weren't able to, the way Fort Macon was designed, they couldn't really shoot directly into the walls, but they could get close enough to live mortars. And they figured out where the magazine was. Well, they should have known where it was. It was their fort in the first place. And they just dropped rounds on top of the magazine until roof of the magazine cracked, surrendered. Fort Caswell, right down here at the mouth of the Cape Fear River on the tip of Oak Island. When war breaks out, it's the strongest, it's the only real fortification in Cape Fear. And for the longest time, even after Fort Fisher started, Fort Anderson comes online, it's still considered the strongest fort until April of 1862. It goes from the strongest to the absolute weak point. And it's all because of rifled artillery. And it comes in all different sizes. A lot of the rifle guns in the South are being imported, mostly English guns, Blakely's, Whitworth's, right. But they did have domestically made guns. Now, unfortunately, they would have to repurpose. Remember those 1,198 guns I mentioned earlier? Well, they repurposed a lot of those by taking them to Tredegar and rifling them,
Adding bands.
and then adding bands. And the bands were to keep the guns from bursting. That's the one thing they couldn't figure out or couldn't stop an iron gun from doing, was bursting. So even with the better developed northern guns, the 20-pound Parrott rifle, the 30-pound Parrott rifle, those guns, even though they're manufactured in the North and supposedly with better metal and better technology, these guns were notorious for bursting.
Yeah, I mean, during the first battle of Fort Fisher, we had 5 100-pound Parrott guns explode on board the Ticonderoga, the Quaker City, the Yantic, Juanita, and Mackinac.
Yeah.
So you have, men getting killed and wounded by these guns bursting.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
So even though the technology is advancing, you're getting these guns, you're getting better guns always. You're still limited with the technology of casting the iron. They're mainly cast iron guns, and they've got to be reinforced. When Phoenixville Ironworks in 1860 comes out with the 3-inch ordnance rifle, which is a wrought iron gun, that changes American artillery, because of those original 3-inch, I think it was 1,000 3-inch ordnance rifles that were cast, only one ever burst, and that was gun number 0. And they did that while they were testing it. They abused that gun for a week before it finally gave up the ghost. There was still 3-inch ordnance rifles in American inventory into the Philippine insurrection in 1903 and all that. So.
Yeah, thank you. I honestly didn't know that much about the weapons technology either, so it's always great to learn.
I can go on for hours about that. So.
All right, so before we transition again, I was curious if we had any audience questions. Yes, ma'am.
Just when you say a rifle, are you talking about just what one man holds?
No. Okay, so you've got 2 types of artillery. You got smooth bore, which fires a cannonball. Then you've got a rifled gun that's got grooves in it that fires a bullet-shaped projectile.
So think of 007, you know how it has the spiral?
Yeah, it's the same thing.
Same thing.
So it's just like a handheld rifle, only you've got 8 to 10 men that have got to work that gun. And they came in all different sizes and had all different ranges. The key to rifled artillery was you had better range, better accuracy, higher muzzle velocity, and better penetration against brick structures. Against sand, poof. So what happens is you get Fort Fisher. You can pound that fort all you want to. It's made of sand. You hit it, the shell explodes, you got a hole. What does the sand do? Fills in the hole. You can't, it's so much or rifle is a brick fortification. The Civil War was the death, for the most part, the death of fixed large fortifications.
All right, we're gonna fast forward a little bit here and jump into after Fort Fisher. So we established our foothold at Fort Fisher. Established our foothold at Fort Fisher. by the end of January 15th, 1865, the Union's exhausted. So we regroup, we do some reconnaissance missions, we prepare to charge into Wilmington. And so one important role that I don't think they get enough credit for is during the Battle of Fort Fisher, U.S. colored troops hold the rear line for the Union about 2 miles north of Fort Fisher, right around where Curry Beach Boardwalk is today, if you're from the area. And so by doing this, they actually prevent Confederates from Sugarloaf, which is a battery about 6 to 10 miles north of there, from coming down and reinforcing Fort Fisher and essentially surrounding or sandwiching those white Union soldiers inside Fort Fisher. Without their steadfastness in holding back that attack, the Battle of Fort Fisher might have gone differently. We might not have established, the Union might not have established that foothold here in the region. So this is their major test, the USCT's major test at Fort Fisher is holding that rear line. They do well. One of the white brigades stationed with them actually had retreats, so we could see the war-worn U.S. colored troop veterans holding their ground and doing their job and taking great pride in it. But they're really essentially just a skirmish force for the Battle of Fort Fisher. It is after Union captures Fisher that the USCTs really lead a major charge from Fisher up this western bank. They have a battle against those same troops at Sugarloaf, this is now an island, which by this map is confusing, but peninsula at the time, right around here. And they continue to chase the fleeing Confederates north. So along the way, of course, the Confederates stop at Forks Road, which is just a few miles outside town here. By February 21st, there's that last Confederate line here at Forks Road. So Daniel, can you tell us a little bit more about those Confederate works built at Forks Road as they retreated towards town? What makes this such a daunting obstacle as the last hurrah for the U.S. colored troops in the campaign?
Well, we're not in an open field. Of course, a lot of it's cleared out now for residential areas and businesses and Cameron Art Museum. But that area was dense forest and dense thicket that you can't really march through. Also, our area is on top of a large swampy Carolina Bay. And so where the Confederates dig in, it's very strategic because the only way you can attack their position is through a frontal assault. There's not a lot of room for pinching or flanking. You just have to attack them straight on. So the brunt of their forces weren't on our grounds, they were spread out. So Dr. Fonville, who excavated a lot of that spot, believes that they ran about 5 miles long and ended around where Longleaf Park is today. But they still had thousands of troops spread out, and they even had room for some small artillery as well too. So it was a really tough position to kind of dislodge them from. And as a matter of fact, the USCT who fights at Forks Road, they don't successfully dislodge the Confederates from that position. They get turned around each day. But I guess the best part of this story is that frontal assault is almost a suicide charge. You're just running straight into fire. But the best part about this is the fact that these USCT, these colored troops, they did this with their heads held high. And they did this with no questions asked because the majority of the United States colored troops were formerly enslaved. So when you think about everything that, when you think about most of these men, what all they had to do to get to this point in their life, it just becomes another day. Each day for them, whether that's through enslavement or escaping, remaining free, because not until the end of the war, technically, if you make it to the North, you're still a fugitive on paper by law. So each day runs the chance of death or some sort of trauma or being sold. So when they're tasked with charging straight into fire, they do this no questions asked. But yeah, it was a very tough spot to get to, and they actually get turned around about 150 yards away at the end of each charge before they sent out that scout and the Confederates had abandoned positions. So I believe the general for the Confederates at that point, he was holding out for reinforcements, I believe. He felt like if he could stay there long enough and not give them their position, Wilmington could be saved and the South could continue to fight. I don't know exactly how this happens, but at some point in time, he gets word that Essentially telling him, listen, you can stay here if you want, but reinforcements aren't coming.
And get no help.
Yeah. So then they initially abandoned that position.
Yeah, another feature of the U.S. colored troops is, as opposed to a lot of the white regiments who are bloodied, been in battle, they know they take off a lot of their adornments, your breastplates and stuff like that, or they let them stay tarnished, because you get a nice shiny breastplate, that's a target.
Yeah.
U.S. colored troops were proud. They were proud of their uniforms. They were proud of their standing. They kept their brass polished, knowing that it very well could lead to their death or wounding. But they were proud, and they wanted everyone to know they were coming.
And you also had several Medal of Honor recipients from the Petersburg campaign who were with the USCTs here during the Wilmington campaign. So I think that speaks.
So some of the regiments that are down here fighting, because majority of the USCT did hold labor roles. They would come in after a battle was over. They would provide help with transporting things. But with that task with capturing Wilmington being so important, they brought down battle-hardened soldiers. These men had major combat experience.
Yeah.
Over that last year of the war, fighting up in
1904, 1804, yeah.
A lot of them were highly distinguished. Their generals praised them for how fast they trained, for how fast they picked up, how fast they picked up their duties, how fast they learned how to be well-trained in fighting soldiers. But this also speaks to that moment, or speaks to the idea that these men were so prepared and ready to fight. A few years into the war, they thought this would be quick, but the war just keeps raging on. It's hard to get new enlistments. They have this quota system, you have this bounty system. You're trying to get more troops and recruits to fill in the ranks. These USCT, prior to them putting on these blue uniforms, they had been wanting to fight as soon as the war started. And of course, we knew the South wasn't going to arm black men, but the North didn't want to arm them either. We know Abraham Lincoln said, we could end this war, we can keep this union together without freeing the slaves. We will do that. I'm doing whatever it takes to keep this nation together. But from the moment that this war kicks off, you have freedom up North who want to enlist and fight. You have Southerners escaping and wanting to fight. And my thing is, I wouldn't bat an eye. You've been a slave your whole life. The moment you get across the Mason-Dixon line, maybe the moment you get into the territory, you have your first drop of freedom. And I don't think I would have questioned anyone who wants to hold on to something that's so new to them, but also so dear to them. But from the moment that the emancipation goes into effect in January 1863 to the end of the war, which isn't even a total of 24 months, we see upwards of 180,000 men enlisted. And that's a quick turnaround. You have tens of thousands of people escaping. And as soon as they get the chance to put their pen on paper and sign themselves up, that's what they do.
And you also see African Americans who have basically made it to Canada come back and join the USCTs and fight.
Right.
So
While white Northerners and Southerners are arguing what this war is about secession, it's about slavery, it's about keeping the Union together. African Americans are very resoundingly knowing that this is over freedom. So they start to push the envelope for freedom long before Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, by way of escaping to the U.S. Army, the U.S. Navy throughout the war, forcing this issue of we're to show up, we're to claim our freedom, we're to do everything we can. How can we help? How do we push this towards a war truly about the end of slavery? So they play a critical role in that. And one thing I've learned from you, Daniel, and all of our talks is not just this mentality, this prizing of freedom and duty the USCTs have. It's that this runs really, really deep, not just for people formerly enslaved in the South or people born free in the North in these regiments. We have, as you've told me, people as young as 14 or into their 70s enlisting in U.S. colored troop regiments. And so I was curious if you could tell us a little bit about why you think we see so many diverse people in these U.S. colored troops across these age lines and from this geography.
Well, it was an opportunity that had never arisen yet in this country. All around this country, like I said, they're having such a hard time bolstering up their ranks because there's so many people, south and north, didn't want to fight. You might believe in, the government or the tenets of what makes up your ruling party, what makes up your, Congress. It doesn't mean you want to fight a war. And now this war has engulfed the whole nation, and it's brought a lot of people into who feel like they have no business being there, support or no support. But like you said, from the moment this war starts, there's this rallying cry, there's this call that young and old heard in the African American community, whether that's free or formerly enslaved. So in our records, 4 Forks Road, the youngest we found was 14 and the oldest we found was 79, which I think is absolutely beautiful because when you see those ages, your immediate response is, well, what can they do? But the way I like to envision it, I don't know exactly how this happened, but when you go through the muster rolls, you see a lot of people coming from the same area. It's almost like caravans of people enlisting or recruiters coming to these areas where a bunch of formerly enslaved men find themselves. And you see a lot of people enlisting on the same day, same names. They could be family members, they could be coming from the same plantation, but you believe there's brothers, parents, uncles, cousins, best friends. And so you see all these people signing up that are so dear to you. No matter how old you were, 14 or 79, you say, listen, you're not leaving me here. I'm coming with you. How can I help? And so we just see waves of people. I mean, a lot of these areas where people escape to, they get 10s, 20s, 30s, hundreds of enlistments on the same day. And I think they all look at each other and say, all right, let's do this.
But did I understand you right that they were not guaranteed to be free, even they're still considered fugitives? What was that? What did you say about that? I didn't
Well,
understand.
prior to the war starting,
The term contraband and all
Right.
that,
this
it
was
was part of the
prior to-
fugitive, yeah, it's
Oh,
the
okay. I missed
fugitive,
that.
yeah, they were
Okay.
considered fugitives,
and
And
they're
even during the war,
and even during
that
the
made
war
it to the north or made it to occupied territory.
territory.
And
They
you
were
gotta think
considered,
there's border states too. So there's Union states that still had slavery because they weren't rebelling. So technically, under the law of the US government, if you escape, you can be given back. Where they become contraband is the US doesn't want to observe rules for a foreign entity, even though technically secession is not even legal and they lose the war, so they never officially become a real country.
yeah,
They don't get recognized. Because they're rebelling, they see them as this foreign entity that they don't have to abide by those laws, and so they start to keep them. And that word spreads quick. Because technically contraband, the idea of being contraband is the first time an enslaved person or escaped enslaved African has any type of real right. You make it to the north, doesn't mean anything. That's why so many try to get to Canada, but depending on where you're coming from, that's virtually impossible.
Looking through our Asian and Pacific Islanders, there is a guy I found who I thought joined the US Navy, and he was from Honolulu. He's with the 6 USCTs here during the Wilmington Campaign. And he was considered a substitute for somebody up north. So,
And
which I thought was very
after the occupation of Smithville, fall of Wilmington, the 35th, 36th, 37th US Colored Troops, which are pretty much North Carolina
yeah.
raised units, they immediately replenished their numbers just from recruitments.
And also the Pequod and some of these other vessels that are in Wilmington, they are recruiting African Americans to join the fleet because a lot of people are getting out, so they need to replenish the numbers. So they're
And yeah, and also once Wilmington's taken, the revenue cutter service can come back into the Cape Fear. The revenue cutter service is the predecessor to the US Coast Guard. They're recruiting African American sailors.
One thing I'd like to add, going back to the question about their status is, throughout the war, up until the end of 1865, when the 13th Amendment is officially passed, they are still officially legally in limbo, regardless of their status as soldiers. And so the Confederacy makes a law that says if they if they capture US colored troops, they are going to treat them as enslaved people, and officially they're going to try and return them to their enslaver. Now, how do you find an enslaver in the middle of a bloody, long, drawn-out conflict? More likely than not, these men are executed, and we see that time and time again at different massacres throughout the war, including one here at Plymouth, where General Hope, who is the leader at Sugarloaf, oversees Confederate troops to massacre US colored troop recruits in North Carolina. So it is a very high stakes for all of these men who put their lives on the line. White, Black, Hispanic, Asian, everyone faced the risks of death, but at least if you're outside the US colored troop regiments, you're guaranteed more or less to be taken as POW. Is not the case for the US colored troops. And they know that, and they continue to fight regardless, which is why I think their story is so incredible. And I know we're running a little short on time, so we're gonna fast forward ahead again. So February 22nd, Wilmington is officially captured. We have this jubilee, this celebration among the now formerly enslaved here in town as the Union liberates the city. And so that creates this question. For the first time, we have freedom, but we still don't have equality. And there's this question about, what do we do now? What do we do? What do these people do? What do we do? How do we all interact with one another in this environment? So Jim, I know Fort Anderson plays an important role in these early months of freedom for many of the local African Americans. Can you tell us a bit about their experience and what happens at Fort Anderson?
Sure. Flip slides.
I got it.
Oh, you got it? Oh,
Yeah.
that's right. You can do it. There we go. So you're going to have, with the fall of Wilmington and with South Carolina, Sherman going through South Carolina, coming into North Carolina, you now have a large population of what's now considered freedmen. And with the fall of Wilmington, you've got the establishment of the Freedmen's Bureau in Wilmington. What are you going to do with all these people? How's the government going to take care of them? I mean, and then with Sherman on his way into North Carolina, he's got a whole army of refugees following him, upwards of 20,000.
If not more.
If not more. The map up here shows, I'll show you. When Sherman gets to the outskirts of Fayetteville, when he gets to the outskirts of Fayetteville, he realizes he cannot feed his men and these 20,000 to 25,000 refugees that are with him. Now, these refugees have been divided. They're all intermingled with the brigades, the divisions, and the corps in his army. He's got 6 crossing points across the Cape Fear River at Fayetteville. And each wing of his army has a section that they're going to cross. So when they cross the river onto this bank of the opposite bank of Fayetteville, he has all the refugees banded together. So they're the ones that are with brigades are put with divisions. The ones with divisions are put with corps. So now when he crosses the river, he's got 3 collections of refugees. And as the army moves further into North Carolina, getting ready to have the battles at Aversboro and Bentonville, he's got to figure out what to do with the refugees. He's already caught hell once, because not long after he left Savannah, he crossed the river in South Carolina, cut the pontoon bridges, and stranded about 15,000 refugees on the opposite bank. They were promptly gathered up by
Jefferson Davis did that. General Jefferson Davis did that.
Yeah, General Jefferson Davis did that.
Yeah, did that.
But they were promptly gathered up by the Confederates and put back in slavery. Sherman, the press ate him alive. So he wasn't going to do that again. So when he crosses the river at Fayetteville, he's got a plan. So all these refugees are banded together into 3 groups and then brought together in one. And then they're going to be transported down the Cape Fear River. Now, there's a mixture of white and African-American refugees in here. The white refugees, numbering a few thousand, are put on boats. They get to ride the boats down the river to Wilmington. And they're yeah, okay, we're going to Wilmington. Yeah. The steamboats get down to Wilmington and keep right on going. They go out the Cape Fear River and they turn north and they drop all these white Southern refugees off at a little place called Ellis Island and put them in the control of U.S. immigration officials. Their whole story is a whole different one. Now, the African-American refugees, they're brought together and they move into the interior towards what's now Clinton, or Clinton as I grew up saying. We gave our tea to Wilston. And they basically follow what we would now consider Highway 421. Straight down. 421, the road they take is a little bit west of 421, but it essentially goes through Moores Creek Battlefield and it ends up down here at Point Peter, outside of Wilmington. And unit officials they're given full warning that the refugees are coming. And they have piles of supplies waiting for them when they arrive at Point Peter. The problem is they can't get into Wilmington. They won't be allowed into Wilmington because Wilmington already has an Army of Occupation. They've got recently released POWs. They've got Confederate POWs. They got their own refugees from the countryside. And they've got probably triple digits of different diseases breaking out. So if they bring these refugees into Wilmington, it's going to explode, not from violence, but from disease. By the time this refugee train makes it to Wilmington, it's dwindled down to somewhere between 8,500 and 15,000. And they're given supplies, and then they're immediately distributed to the various plantations, primarily on the west bank of the Cape Fear River. The Brunswicktown, Fort Anderson, Smithville side of the plantation, or side of the river. But the main two refugee camps are going to be at Fort Anderson and Smith Island, which y'all refer to now as Baldhead Island. And Smith Island's supposed to hold somewhere between 750 and 1,000. Fort Anderson is supposed to hold around 1,500. To give you an eyewitness account of what happens. Let's see, this is a letter written in September of 1865. There's still a refugee camp at Fort Anderson. Though most have been removed and returned some 20 miles down the river, where hundreds of desolate dependent beings yet remain with ill provision for comfort or employment. The forlorn, emaciated look, the base covering of filthy rags, the utter indifference to the common instincts and necessities of life, the absence of all natural promptings of humanity, etc., beggars all description. Among these, disease found an easy prey, and death soon ended the sufferings of many, as the 1,000 rude clustered graves sadly testify. This is written by an eyewitness. He was a missionary who was helping with these refugees. That's at Fort Anderson. To give you a more specific, this is written by Surgeon M.K. Hogan, who took over the department as chief surgeon in November of 1865. His report, in March 1865, about 10,000 Negroes were sent down the Cape Fear River to Wilmington by General Sherman, the town being already badly crowded by Negroes and refugees. A camp was established for them at Fort Anderson on the Cape Fear. At this camp, sickness prevailed to an alarming extent. Several acting assistant surgeons were sent there, but as reported to me by Surgeon Hand, late medical director of the department, paid very little attention to the sick. It is estimated that over 2,000 Negroes died there between March 17th and May 31st, an average of about 30 a day. Now, the one thing I can tell you that's wrong in that is March 17th, they weren't here yet. So add about a week and a half to that. But you can still hold that May 31st number. You're talking about upwards of 2,000 people dying at Fort Anderson in the refugee camp in a 9-week period. Fort Anderson was I'm gonna look at Fort Anderson as the exception. Fort Anderson was so remote and was so concentrated that it was very easy to, when a disease broke out on the plantation close by, they would just take anyone sick and move them to Fort Anderson. So Fort Anderson is basically a death camp for all intents and purposes. Based on the few accounts that we have, and there, the Joseph Longley, who's the missionary who wrote this letter, he wrote another letter days after visiting Fort Anderson, and he says basically the same thing. At the time, it's hundreds, if not 1,000, graves that he witnessed. You're looking at what they're looking at smallpox. Now, what was supposed to hold 1,500 in April 13th, 65, it's got 3,400 people. That's April 13th. April 24th, there's 3,300. June 1st, there's 2,200. So the numbers start dropping. The reason for that is the refugees were going to be given everything they needed, rations, everything, from the time they hit the refugee camps until June 1st. June 1st, technically everything's supposed to run out. But they were going to be given transport anywhere they wanted to go. The Army and the Navy would transport them back to South Carolina, to Virginia, to California if they wanted to go. And a lot of them took them up. But you still had quite a few that remained in Cape Fear and made it their homes.
Jim, I'm sorry, I'm gonna cut you off.
Oh no, I was about done right there anyway. So yeah, it's a scary thing, and it happened, and we're still doing the research on it. The big thing is we haven't found the mass grave yet, but we're looking.
Well, there's so many stories of this Wilmington campaign to go just beyond, what our main story is. These primarily white Confederate Union regiments clashing with each other all throughout the Lower Cape Fear. As Becky has shown, we've got Asian Americans and Hispanic and people from Africa directly. We have U.S. colored troops, and after the battles and the war, we have this question of what to do with freedom playing out. Not always as depressingly as the Fort Anderson story goes.
Sorry.
We have it's an important part of the history, but we have this growing community here in Wilmington that develops into a absolutely thriving Black community within a few decades until 1898 here in Wilmington.
Okay, did I add one thing?
Yeah.
Okay, this is quick. Same missionary. The colored people of Wilmington number some 6,000 as a class. They are not inferior in intelligence and enterprise. A few have always been free as far as the usage of slavery permit. Secretly securing the instruction of their children. They comprise some of the best citizens and mechanics, having houses, stores, sometimes shops, and some means of their own. Most of them, however, were freed from the military possession of the city.
Perfect summary. So that's what this whole series that we've been putting on January and February for Fisher, as well as Cameron Art Museum and the New Hanover County Library. This series called 12 with Gratitude and Pride, New Perspectives on the Wilmington Campaign. And our goal has really been to continue to honor and commemorate, yes, the white soldiers and sailors who fought through the campaign, but to draw out these experiences of Black, Hispanic, Asian, and Indigenous Americans who are also all caught up here. And I chose that tagline, 12 with Gratitude and Pride. It comes from a letter from Sergeant Arnold of the 4th U.S. Colored Troops, where he's addressing their men as the regiment's decommissioning. And in summary, he says that he hopes that the descendants of the regiment, his children, his grandchildren, will dwell with gratitude and pride when they think back to all that the regiment has achieved. And he specifically names Fort Fisher among the honors, as well as the Battle of Newmarket Heights and Petersburg and other major campaigns that we hear of up in Virginia. While they didn't play that pivotal role in Fort Fisher, we might necessarily expect with that moniker. We see that across all sorts of lines, age, gender, race, Wilmington Campaign meant something for these people. It was important to be a part of. They understood the importance. And we hope today you kind of understand the importance of the campaign and the various people who are in it. So I'm going to end with one last question to our panel, and our audience will be happy to answer questions one-on-one as we go. And so very, very briefly, we are continuing at our sites and the Cameron Art Museum to kind of explore these diverse stories and part of our history. So what is something that Fort Fisher, Cameron Art Museum, and Fort Anderson are doing on tours and educational programs, et cetera, to continue to highlight the importance of important contributions of people across racial lines in the Civil War?
You know, we're working on a new museum at Fort Fisher. And so by finding these stories, we can incorporate them into our interpretation that might have been forgotten about. So I think that's really exciting. And also, you know, expanding our wayside panels on the battlefield as well. I think we can pull some of these stories and do that.
So at Cameron Art Museum, I'm very grateful for everyone here on this panel because they've given me a lot of the military context of everything. I'm not a war person at all. That's just the context of my work. And I look more into social histories. And so what my job is at Cameron Art Museum is to locate and contact descendants of the soldiers who fought on our grounds, because documentation for African Americans isn't well kept at this time. Of course, it's kept well during the war, the muster rolls, but as soon as that war ends, these people kind of almost cease to exist. We know where they go. Names are changing. People are moving all around the country, starting new lives. And so a lot of these stories of these soldiers, as we try to find more narratives to, present to the community through artistic expression, we find these stories in families. We find it in local histories passed down in churches and communities. And so we're going to be starting an oral history project this summer. Some of the documents, or some of the descendants we found, and we're going to be talking to them and hearing the importance of the stories to them and their family, and their ability to be here today, standing on their own too, and how they directly are honoring themselves, these men that we have now immortalized on our grounds. And we look to host our first Descendants Day come this fall at Cameron Art Museum.
So we have not, because of the refugee crisis, there's not a lot of artifacts. So what we're working on is establishing waysides on the site to try to get the story out. We're hoping sometime in the next few months, we'll have our first wayside concerning the refugee crisis. But we're kind of unique in that we're a couple of sites in one. So what Becky and was talking about with African slaves escaping and going to the Union Navy, 100 years before, they were doing the same thing, only going to the British Navy. Give you an example of one of the people I'm researching right now is a man named Thomas Peters. Thomas Peters was a slave he was a millwright in Wilmington. In March of 1776, he escaped, made his way down the river, got onto the Royal Navy, was recruited by Sir Henry Clinton, who established an all-black brigade called the Black Pioneers. After the war, Thomas Peters ends up with a lot of these men in Canada, Nova Scotia. 1791, he goes to Sierra Leone and helps start the country of Sierra Leone. So we're working on all that.
All right. Well, I know they're about to shut the lights off, so I apologize for running a little late. Thank you so much to our panelists today. One-on-one questions. I wish we could do more questions at the end, but we're happy to answer more one-on-one as we all walk out.
And I'll hang out outside if you want.
But thank you guys.